There are really two questions about the origins of the Holocaust. The first is a question about the course of German history over the long term. One group of historians claims that there was something special, something peculiar, something particular about German society. Some people say going back perhaps as far as Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, that led somehow, inescapably, to the extermination of the Jews in the middle of the 20th century. What do they point to? Well, they point to the development of a strong authoritarian state, bureaucratized, strongly associated with the military. They point to a sense of national identity that is imbued with a sense of organic wholeness and purity defined in terms of blood. They point to the political inadequacies of the German middle class, who were quite ready to embrace popular nationalism in the 19th century, but quite hesitant in their embrace of middle-class liberal political values, failing in the Revolution of 1848 to establish more representative forms of government, and that somehow this weakness produced a culture that was capable of identifying the Jewish people as its persistent enemy across the centuries and ultimately in the 20th century with fatal consequences. Other historians point out that at the end of the 19th century, Germany looks a lot like France and Britain. And if you wanted to find a place that was rife with murderous anti-Semitism in, say, the 1890s, you wouldn't have looked to Germany, you would have looked to France, where the Dreyfus Affair revealed that many people in France were quite willing to agitate in favor of expelling the Jews from the polity. And there were riots where Jews were killed. There were other places that had strong military traditions, other places with strong nationalist traditions. And if we want to understand what happened, this terrible crisis in Germany in the 20th century, we have to look at the crisis above all of the Civil War. I'm sorry, the crisis of the First World War and the economic crisis of the interwar period, which is more devastating, which produces the circumstances in which a group like Hitler's Nazi Party could seize power. The second big debate about the origins of the Holocaust has to do with the way in which the policy of extermination unfolded, starting in the late 1930s after the Nazis had seized power in Germany, and then during the Second World War itself. One group assumes primary responsibility for Hitler himself and the high command. Hitler made his intentions clear with his violent rhetoric quite early. You can look back to the 1920s in Mein Kampf. The Jews were the enemy. They needed to be persecuted. Another group points out, though, that it's important to distinguish between the violence of the rhetoric and the actual capacity to carry out these terrible threats. It wasn't possible for the Germans to implement a policy of extermination against European Jews until after the invasion of the Soviet Union, because it was at that point that the vast majority of the Jews in Europe who lived in Eastern Europe came under their control. And it was until 1941, in fact, members of the Nazi leadership, including Heinrich Himmler, were still anticipating defeating Britain after by invasion. That hadn't failed yet. And if that was possible, then they could still take control of the Indian Ocean and export the Jews to Madagascar. This was debated as late as 1941. Once the decision was made, it's pretty clear that the decision was made somewhere at the top in 1941, the actual unfolding of the killing itself in the concentration camps appears to have been not very well coordinated from the top. And much of the murderous efficiency was produced by a kind of competition between different elements of the Nazi hierarchy competing with one another in order to outdo themselves in the service of this duty that they felt they had to undertake. Nobody disputes the consequences, of course, the murder of 6 million people. But the debate about the circumstances that made it possible continues.